Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about an important concept in regards to lawmaking and law enforcement that I think a lot of people don't discuss, or at least it isn't as discussed as I think it needs to be. And what reminded me of this particular issue is that I, Carl Emmerich, and Stephen Ignoramus are planning on having a discussion about immigration at some point in the future. We haven't nailed down when we're going to do it, what the date for that is going to be, but that reminded me of the issue of language. And language is very important for legality for one particular reason, and that is that if we are going to write down our laws in a written form, then to obey the laws, we then have to base that on the written form. Now, what does that have to do with language? Because obviously things are written linguistically, so obviously that's the intersection. But what does this have to do with immigration? Well, in the context of, for example, the United States of America, what you have is a country that is largely English speaking, wherein the laws in as far as I am aware of, all jurisdictions, but there might be a couple of exceptions, I don't know. But it's fair to say that most laws, at least in the United States, are written and or at least enacted in the English language. But a lot of the immigrants to the United States come from areas where English is not spoken. And in the case of the United States, a lot of the immigration includes some people that don't know English at all, not even as a second language. Now, a lot of people say that they should learn English, and I agree that they should learn English. And before people say, "Oh no, that's racist," Anna Wiltus, you can't say that. Let me just say that first of all, I'm not an English person, so ethnically speaking, um, I'm not. I wasn't born in a household that spoke English as a first language. Um, Second of all, okay, I learned English as a third language. Okay, so English wasn't even my second language; it's my third language. And third of all, I wrote and published a book in English, so I'm well capable of speaking and comprehending the English language. And what I'd like to say is that if I can do it, other people can probably also do it. And some people might say, well, you're just a smart person. But I think that if you learn a language once, you can probably learn another language at some point through some effort, even if it's difficult, even if you have difficulty learning. The fact that you're speaking one language in the first place indicates that you do have the mental capacity to potentially speak another language. Now, why is this important? Why is it important that people learn this language? Why don't we just write the laws? Because the purpose here, what I'm talking about, is legality and law enforcement, is to have the people know the language that the law is in so that they can obey it more easily and so that they can understand the laws. But why not just write the law in multiple languages? Why should we have a monolingual legal system? And the answer to that is not as apparent to people that are unilingual or monolingual. I think unilingual is probably a smoother way to say it. People that are unilingual probably aren't as likely to be aware of this as people that are multilingual like I am, because I've been fluent in English, German, Italian, and I also have some knowledge of Spanish, Koine Greek, and classical Latin. So in that sense, I'm a bit well-rounded linguistically. So I'm as good as anyone when it comes to being able to offer an experience on why it's important to have laws in only one particular language. And when I say this, I don't mean that we don't offer translations of legal proceedings, we don't offer translations of laws. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we should have one language that all the laws are legally in, and all the other languages, if we make translations, the translation of the law into a different language doesn't have the force of law as the law has in the original language. And the reason for this is because when you translate words, even if you translate very literally or you follow the context, what you have to understand is that words have a denotative meaning, and the translation of one word into another word, and the denotative meaning is the definition of the word that you'd find in a dictionary, for example. Uh, when you translate one word into another word in a different language, even if it means the same thing in the same context, what you have to understand is that the words might have a different semantic domain. And what is a semantic domain? A semantic domain is essentially the different ways that you can use a word. And for example, the word toilet, okay, in American English and in British English have an overlapping semantic domain. In other words, you could mean the same thing, but they also have a different semantic domain, so that if, let's say, an American person says toilet, a British person could understand that they might be referring to the actual device in the restroom, or the American person could simply be intending the water closet, the restroom itself, which in the British context is less likely. You understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that toilet, even in a different dialect of the same language, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing at all times, even if it does mean the same thing sometimes. And this is true about pretty much any language that you translate into different languages. And the reason for this is, well, the languages have a different history, a different origin. They developed in a different way, and the colloquial use of the language ultimately helps define what its definition is. For example, the word gay, it it used to simply refer to an emotional state or to something evocative of that emotional state, but now it has a reference to the idea of homosexuality, and this has now been commonly accepted to the point where it's fair to say that it's no longer a connotative meaning, that is to say, something that you simply infer from the context as a euphemism, for example, but it is part of its denotative meaning now. So that's an example of a word where the meaning has changed. So that's why when people have a doctrine on legal interpretation or hermeneutics where they look at a law, they tend to go to the dictionaries that were around when those laws were written, because that helps to get a more accurate view of the language that the law has. That is to say, the semantic domain of the words used. Because what happens over time is that the way you use words can change, and because of that, the meanings of words can change. And the same thing is true over linguistic boundaries, that the way in which sentences are structured in different languages is different, and therefore the implications that you can draw from the structure of a sentence are different. So to make a truly 100% accurate to the original context and meaning, translation of a law, you'd probably have to make it at least 10 times longer than the original in order to explain the minute differences in semantic domain and to define what the words originally mean. And I'm keenly aware of this as someone that, for example, studies the Bible, where looking at English and Greek, what you have is that the words don't necessarily translate one to one. There are some words that from Greek can have multiple English translations, or some words from English that can have multiple Greek translations. So the same is true for Spanish and English. And I think anybody that's multilingual can probably attest to this, that sometimes it's difficult to translate things because of the different meanings that the words have. And so it's important to therefore have a clearly defined language that the law is in, because if you allow all translations of the law to have equal legal weight, it essentially means that the form and the definition of the law is more flexible than if it is a simple single language system. And the reason why this is a problem, why is it a problem that the law and the form of it is flexible? Why is that a problem? Well, you could argue from a few different directions on this, but for one, flexibility in how you interpret the law. That is to say, for example, let's say you don't take a literal interpretation where you look at definitions of words and you try to be very strict to what the words mean, and instead you take a more fluid interpretation. What it essentially means is that you can change the law without having to go through the actual legal process to change the law. Another problem is the idea of fairness that a lot of people have, that a lot of people have an idea that the law should be fair or that it should apply equally. But if you use this type of loose interpretation, people can essentially cherry pick the way they want to interpret the law to fit their own purposes rather than to fit what the law is there for. And what I think is the law should be interpreted strictly, which is not to say that I'm opposed to ideas that the law might be wrong on something. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that then, once you know that there is something that is wrong through the strict adherence of the law, what you then have is the opportunity to change the law in order to make a better law. And that's not something that happens as easily if you use more loose or fluid definitions, because then what happens is that rather than fixing the law, people end up simply piling up laws on top of each other, where let's say the police chooses not to enforce a certain law, so then new laws are made, and you end up with a legal nightmare. So having clearly defined and strictly adhered to laws creates a more equitable system of justice. That is to say, a system of justice that treats people more equally, and also a system of justice that is less prone to becoming a spaghetti mess of bureaucracy. And that's what I think is supremely important here, and why it is important to have a single language that is official for legal purposes. Now, people might say, well, since society changes and the language changes, how do you prevent it from coming to the stage that happened in medieval Europe, where people used to speak Latin, but now Latin is a more antiquated language, and nobody understands the law because nobody can read the law, etc. Well, I think what should happen is people in schools should actually read the law. Yeah, I know it sounds boring to a lot of young people, but it's very important because if you can't read the law and you don't understand it, what how to be more exact, can you expect yourself to be a law-abiding citizen? And therefore, I think it's important to read the law in order to be able to obey it more fully. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't really interested in knowing what the law says. And unfortunately, because places like the United States have taken a sort of fast and loose approach to legality, where they pick and choose which laws to enforce, and they're flexible in how they want to interpret the law. And as far as I'm aware, there's no official language, although you could say that the text of the law, as it is originally written, is the actual law. And therefore, that translations would be inferior, since we don't actually have a constitutionally defined legal language. People can attack that idea to some extent. But that being said, all of this leads to a situation where you have an excess amount of superfluous laws that constantly need to be looked at and simplified, and that essentially everybody can be considered a criminal under some form of law. You're committing a crime every day, and it's very unreasonable. And people might say, well, maybe we shouldn't enforce these laws because they're unreasonable laws. Well, here's what I say: if you enforce these laws to their fullest extent, then everybody will know that they're unreasonable laws because it will actually inconvenience them. And if it's actually inconveniencing them, then maybe we can actually get rid of those laws. Because just building more piles of legal documentation on more laws on top of each other isn't going to help anybody actually be able to obey and follow the law as the government, I hope, desires that they do. I certainly hope that the US government's purpose isn't to criminalize every single person in the country. I hope that their actual purpose is to create laws that both sustain the system of the country and also allow people to know what things are not okay to do in this society. So, for that reason, I think it's very important to be able to read the law. And for that reason, I think it's very important to establish one language as the legal language and to ensure that all people learn that language. I'm not saying that people should be compelled to learn it, but what I am saying is that people in their communities, people in their families, people in their school systems should push to ensure that this is taught. Because if you want to have law abiding citizens, then you should have citizens that actually know what the law is, because they can't abide something that they don't know. So there you go. That's my thoughts on the idea. Tell me what you think. Do you think I'm being silly? Do you think I'm being excessive? Or do you think that this is actually a good idea, that we should have a single legal language, that we shouldn't be in a situation where you've got 20 different translations and you pick and choose what you want to obey? Tell me what you think. And we'll toss over and out.